prices can't go down here. What do I mean by that? What am I referring to? That's going to be the topic of today's video. Hi everyone, so if you're an expat or a high net worth individual, go to infuriated.com and see what we can do for you. Now, on today's video, I'm going to talk about a period of my life when I was actually studying finance. And it was during the, the crisis of 2007, 2008. And during 2006 and 2007, US real estate prices were going down in some parts. The subprime crisis began much before Lehman Brothers collapsed. Now, at that point in time, there was a lot of murmurings in the British press about, okay, could this affect the UK housing market? And what I heard time and time again, even though I thought the UK housing market would go down, is, oh, we're not America, prices can't go down here. And what's interesting about that is, looking back, there was a very severe crisis in the early 90s in the UK housing market. And actually, even though prices went up a few years later, they didn't actually recover before the early 2000s, like in inflation adjusted terms. In other words, if somebody bought one day before the peak in the early 90s, it would have taken about 8 to 10 years or so for the price to recover. So you would have thought that people wouldn't have been so complacent, but actually they were pretty complacent at that time. And I've noticed similar things in many countries. People assume property just can't go down, which actually isn't the case at all. And it taught me a number of things. First of all, never be complacent when it comes to your money. Secondly, when something's familiar to someone, they're more likely to look at the positive. What do I mean by that? Now, it's true to say that the housing market in most major countries has always recovered. It's not the case in every country, like in the UAE and Dubai. That hasn't always been the case, but it is true to say in London, in New York, or many other places in the world, the housing market has always recovered. But the same is actually true of the stock market. And even though many people now know that, okay, the stock market always comes back, even if individual stocks don't always come back, when it comes to housing, it's almost like the belief in housing always going up is almost like a religious thing in some cultures. There's almost like a religious fervor about the housing market, right? It's almost like something that you can say to people in a dinner party, in a middle class dinner party, oh, my house has gone up, or something like this. So what's interesting is, when the housing market goes down, often there's kind of this mass assumption, oh, it's going to go up again. So I can remember in 2009 and 2010, when the British housing market went down, the nationwide building societies numbers said that the average British house went from 183,000 down to about 150, 160,000. Most people are like, oh yeah, it's a bad crisis, the market will come back. But as per one of my other videos, one thing that the British media has seldom mentioned is it's taken about 13 or 14 years for the UK housing market to actually get back to where it was. And now it's adjusted for inflation. This isn't the case in London or some other parts of the country, but if you look nationwide, it's actually taken until about now. And even now, if you look at the prices today compared to, say, at the height in 2008, just before things went really bad, actually they're about the same adjusted for inflation compared to at that point. But hardly anyone in the media actually mentions this. Hardly any British person actually knows this or mentions this. So there is this kind of feeling that houses can only go up. And I think this is something which is true of housing, but it's true of businesses, it's true of stocks and whatever. You shouldn't get into any kind of group thinking. A lot of people, they assume certain things. Like in certain cultures, they assume, okay, gold can only go up, which isn't the case. Actually, gold has been largely stagnant for a lot of its history. Likewise, few people mention about property. The UK property was practically stagnant for 60 years, from 1900 to 1960. The same thing when it comes to businesses. A lot of people assume it must be much more risky to start your own business compared to working for someone, or people might assume the stocks are more risky than real estate. What I would say is, don't get into group thinking. Don't just take what's given to you by your culture or your parents, and don't take it as gospel, basically. Because what I have learned from going all around the world and living in different places is that, whilst for British people, or some British people, owning a house is almost like a religious thing, in some parts of the world it's gold or it's another asset. So It's not unusual for people to get very culturally attached to one asset or the other, but look more broadly. It's a big world out there. There's plenty of assets you can invest in, which sometimes can actually deliver higher returns than that asset which is actually being encouraged by your culture. How can I help you? In two ways. First of all, are you an expat, a high net wealth individual, or just somebody who lives in a part of the world where it's difficult to get access to quality investment solutions? In which case, go onto my website on adamfire.com and find out more. If you don't fit into any of those categories, then in which case there's a range of free material on my website, on this YouTube channel, and indeed on my Quora, where I get over 200 or have received over 231 million views in the last few years. And finally, if you want to actually read my thoughts in more detail, go onto Amazon and find my book on there.